Welcome to the Iran nuclear negotiations, why the Humpty Dumpty JCPOA should not be renewed. Please welcome our host, James Phillips, Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, thank you, Maeve. We're here today to discuss the Iran nuclear negotiations. And as all of you know, the Vienna talks on Iran's nuclear program resumed on Monday. The Biden administration sees the negotiations as a means of reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that the Trump administration withdrew from in 2018. Although the Biden administration acknowledges some of the weaknesses of the Obama-era deal, known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, it hopes to rectify some of those flaws of the deal in a follow-on agreement, but that's something that Iran has rejected out of hand. And Iran looks at the Vienna talks in a totally different way from the U.S., and that's no surprise there. Tehran sees the primary issue is how the U.S. must lift sanctions to return to the good graces of Iran and be allowed to rejoin the JCPOA. Iran's chief negotiator, Ali Bagheri, has made it clear that he is only there to negotiate the lifting of U.S. sanctions. The Iranians claim that they're serious about negotiating in good faith, and they cite the size of their delegation, which has 40 members, but it turns out that most of these Iranian officials deal with sanctions issues, and there are few, if any, nuclear experts. This focus on sanctions makes sense to Iran, since the JCPOA actually did a much better job of dismantling U.S. sanctions on Iran than it did in dismantling Iran's nuclear program. And that's why Iran has been able to ramp up its nuclear activity so quickly in recent months. In fact, Iran was allowed to keep many illicit nuclear facilities that it covertly built before they were discovered. These facilities were legitimized by the JCPOA, despite the fact that Iran's initial failure to declare the nature of those facilities violated Iran's non-proliferation commitments under its Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Safeguards Agreement. Lately, Iran has exceeded the limits of the JCPOA and now enriches uranium up to 60% purity, a very short step from weapons-grade levels of 90% purity. Now there are unconfirmed reports assessing that Iran soon could begin 90% enrichment. Iran also spends advanced centrifuges once restricted by the JCPOA, and its uranium stockpile now far exceeds the Accord's limits. Before going to Vienna, Iran's negotiating demands included the full lifting of all nuclear and non-nuclear sanctions imposed during the Trump administration, a guarantee that the U.S. won't again quit an agreement, and that's something that no president could give, a compensation for economic damage caused by U.S. sanctions since 2018, and a verification period which would allow Tehran to ensure that it is receiving what it considers to be the full economic benefits of the deal before it reverses its violations of the JCPOA. To make matters even worse, Iran has curbed the access of UN nuclear inspectors, which has prevented them from fully monitoring Iran's nuclear program. Last week, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, traveled to Iran for talks, but failed to make any progress on restoring access for his inspectors. Today, we're fortunate to have two recognized experts to discuss the Iran nuclear issue. Dr. Peter Brooks is the Heritage Foundation Senior Fellow for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation. Prior to working at Heritage, he served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He worked as a congressional staffer at the CIA, at the State Department, and initially as a naval officer. He's also a graduate of Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, the Naval War College, and the Defense Language Institute, as well as the U.S. Naval Academy. Our first speaker will be Fred Fleitz. He served for 25 years in national security posts with the CIA, the DIA, the State Department, and the House Intelligence Committee staff. In 2018, he served as the National Security Council Chief of Staff, and Fred is currently the president of the Center for Security Policy and a Newsmax TV contributor. He's written extensively about the Iran nuclear program, including a 2016 book on the JCPOA. So let's kick things off with Fred. I'd like to ask you, Fred, if you could put the current talks in Vienna in context and assess what is likely to come out of them.
Thank you, Jim. It's so great to be here at the Heritage Foundation. The two of you are leading experts on Iran, and I just feel honored to be on a panel with both of you. I think these talks in Vienna are a tipping point for American and European policy on Iran. We know that Joe Biden has been obsessed with getting back into this deeply flawed Obama-era agreement, and the Europeans are with him. But the Iranians have behaved so badly this year. I mean, they've actually physically harassed female IAEA inspectors. They're denying the IAEA access to uranium mines, to facilities making advanced centrifuge parts. They are enriching uranium to 60% uranium-235, and the Israelis believe there's intelligence that Iran is prepared to soon start enriching to weapons grade. Jim, this behavior has been so bad that it looks like these talks are going to close early this week. And I think that Biden, as desperate as he is to revive this Obama-era nuclear deal, and as angry as he is that Trump pulled out of it, I think Biden is prepared to throw in the towel and to move to tough sanctions. That is, to resume President Trump's approach of maximum pressure. And it just kills the Democrats, I think, right now to admit that Donald Trump was right on how to deal with Iran. Diplomacy is not going to work. This is not a nation that wants a diplomatic process to end the nuclear program. And I'd add one final comment. Let's remember that just before these talks began on Monday, the spokesman for the Iranian army reiterated Iran's determination to annihilate the state of Israel. That's how Iran set up these talks. This is not a nation that's prepared to negotiate. It's time for tough sanctions. We need to get the world to unite with us to do that against Iran.
Thanks, Fred. Peter, how do you see the Vienna talks going? Can they succeed in blocking Iran's nuclear ambitions?
Yeah. Fred gave a great summary. It's a pleasure to be working with you, Jim, and Fred on this panel. I think they're going as expected, and I hate to say it, I'm kind of happy that they may end early, because I was worried that the Biden administration might collapse to the Iranian team, that they might give in to Iran's nuclear brinksmanship, especially considering some of the things we've heard recently, the idea that they might enrich to 90% enrichment on uranium. News recently that the breakout time, the time it takes them to gather enough material for one bomb, is down to maybe a month. Maybe for 2 or 3 bombs, it might take 5 months. I mean, this is really scary stuff. So they're kind of going as I expected. I expected the Iranian team to come in with a very hard line stance based on the new president of the country, making outrageous demands. And I think they were hoping that the Biden administration, in hopes of a foreign policy victory by year's end, would give in, would crumble. So in a certain way, although I would like to see them succeed with a tougher agreement, I want our side to succeed with a tougher agreement and put the Iranian nuclear program in the past. I'm glad it appears perhaps if these talks are going to end early, that they will not collapse in terms of the U.S. position, which should be extremely tough, and maybe have to be put off to next year and give a signal to the Iranians that we're not going to give in on these issues that we're so concerned about, such as ballistic missiles and uranium enrichment and the lack of transparency and the possible military dimensions of their program. as well as the inspection regime, which has always been troubling to me. We need anytime, anywhere inspections. The idea that we cannot inspect Iranian military bases or IRGC bases is beyond me. I mean, we know the IRGC is, in charge of this program. So there's so many problems, so many flaws, the sunset provisions that we've talked about, that I hope we send a very strong signal to the Iranians that we are not going to give in, and tougher days could be ahead for them, for this new regime, which I don't think this new regime in Iran wants. So I think that's where they are. It's going to be very, very difficult considering, as Fred pointed out, all the things that Iran has done with their enrichment program. Of course, I'm very concerned about their ballistic missile program. I think it's going to be a very, very difficult set of negotiations, and we're going to have to work very closely with our allies and partners to put Iran in its place on this program, which is illegal under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I think it's going to be very, very tough, and I was worried that they may try to close this up by year's end. I mean, everybody wants to go home for the holidays, whatever holidays they are, the New Year or the Christmas and other things that come at the end of the year. So I'm kind of happy at this point that it looks like we were going to say, hey, your demands are just too much, and we'll think about them, and we'll come back and talk about them again after this. The seventh round, I think this is. So that's kind of where I'm standing at the moment. We'll see what we hear about in the coming hours and days about where the negotiations stand.
Thanks, Peter. And as you point out, this new Iranian president, Raisi, is an ultra hardliner. He's been critical of the previous Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, for negotiating the agreement to begin with. And I just like to ask Fred, how has this new regime accelerated Iran's nuclear program? How does Iran's nuclear program compare to where it was back in July 2015 when the JCPOA was initially negotiated? And how far has Iran advanced its nuclear weapons program since President Biden assumed office in January?
Well, many people think that Iran's nuclear program worsened under President Raisi. I think there's some truth to that, but Supreme Leader Khamenei calls the shots in Iran, and I would note that most of the really serious violations of Iran's NPT commitments began before Raisi won the June election. So I don't think we can attribute all this to him. But it's interesting what we're seeing right now. When Barack Obama became president in 2009, Iran did not have enough enriched uranium to make even one nuclear weapon. But in mid-2015, it had enough to make 10. Now we have a situation where Iran probably has enough enriched uranium to make 3 nuclear weapons, and it is enriching to 60% U-235, which is close to weapons grade, and may start enriching to weapons grade. These are developments we've never seen before. This is a huge move towards making a nuclear weapon just since Joe Biden entered office. But we're seeing the same pattern, just like during the Obama administration. The Iranians engage in outrageously reckless and dangerous behavior, knowing if they behave badly enough, they will be bought off. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we saw with JCPOA, and we're seeing that now. We know in recent months that Biden officials have actually been talking about giving Iran sanctions relief in response to the surge in its nuclear program, and if they'll freeze in exchange for them freezing some of it. This is giving in to blackmail, Jim. We've seen this before. I might add, North Korea has done this for years too. And I think that's Iran's game, to ramp up their program as fast as they can, as far as they can, knowing in the end we're going to blink and we're going to pay them off.
And Peter, we've heard about the status of Iran's nuclear program from Fred, but what is the status of Iran's ballistic missile program, and why is it so important in terms of their nuclear weapons program?
Well, the missile program does not get enough attention, in my view, and of course, the nuclear program is very, very important. I mean, I wish the people would put these two together. I mean, many people don't realize, we hear a lot about Russian missile programs, the Chinese missile programs. We've had the hypersonics. In fact, I've been working on a paper on Chinese hypersonics recently. But this is the largest and most diverse missile program in the Middle East. And I believe it was General McKenzie of CENTCOM the other day gave a number of about 3,000 missiles. Now that probably includes not only ballistic missiles, but it also includes probably cruise missiles. I don't know if he's including UAVs in there, but they have a missile-like quality, unmanned aerial vehicles, and Iranians have used this to tremendous success. They once again they have the capability. They range all of the Middle East with some missiles such as the Shahab 3, the Ahmad, and Sajil that have a 2,000 kilometer range. So that not only covers all of the Middle East, but covers parts of Russia and parts of South Asia. And they've decided that this is going to be an emphasis of theirs because it's very capable. They don't have an air force. It allows them to project power. It gives international prestige. And also another thing, and the reason we're so worried about it is it's a great platform for carrying a nuclear weapon. And as we know, based on the purloined or the stolen or exfiltrated, however you want to put it, materials that the Israelis got out of Tehran, that they were working on a nuclear weapon for a missile. There were drawings of a weapon inside the nose cone of a Shahab 3 under the Ahmad program. It may have stopped in 2003, but I don't know. And of course, we know that they're crafting uranium metal now, which would be required for a nuclear weapon. So there is a tremendous concern about the delivery vehicle. Now, I would say that a nuclear weapon inside the nose cone of a rocket or a missile needs to be able to withstand temperatures and pressures and vibrations of flight and then go explode at the end of that. So it is very, very complicated. But there is tremendous concerns that that's what Iran is going to. So you have a nuclear program, but yet they're talking about there's very likely going to put it in the nose cone of a regional missile, and they're also looking at ICBMs. And I think that their space program is probably a cover for a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile capability, because the technology that's used in an ICBM and a space launch vehicle are essentially the same. And if you can put something into space like that, such as a satellite of a significant weight, you can essentially put a nuclear weapon any place on the Earth's surface, which would include that the U.S. homeland would be at risk. So there's a little bit further down the road, but Iran has made tremendous gains on this. It's great for power projection and intimidates neighbors. It gives them an asymmetrical advantage. It provides defense, deterrence, and it's something that we need to be concerned about when we've seen them used to effect. Right, we've seen these missiles and cruise missiles used against U.S. forces, against Saudi Arabia, against other groups in Iraq, and Iran will continue to emphasize the lethality, the precision capabilities, and also the propulsion capabilities of their missile and cruise missile forces.
Thanks, Peter. And Fred, here's one for you. And I would ask members of the audience, if you have questions, submit them under the question button or whatever the little doodad is. Fred, you had a very important position in the National Security Council during the Trump administration. And I'd like to draw out from you, if you could talk a little about President Trump's May 2018 decision to withdraw from the JCPOA. Why did he wait more than a year into his presidency to do that?
That's a great question, because President Trump's critics have accused him of rushing to get out of the deal, and this wasn't done with due consideration. But in fact, President Trump gave defenders of the deal in the United States and in Europe opportunities to come up with a way to fix it, and they failed. And I think that's very important to recognize that this was a deliberative process and it was a long process. That's the first point. the second point is, and I think the president would recognize this, is that he brought in a number of advisors, such as Rex Tillerson and H.R. McMaster and General Mattis, who did not support his policy on Iran to withdraw from the JCPOA. And there were these long meetings with the president and in the National Security Council when the president had one position and his advisors were fighting for something else. Now, I don't understand how you could take a cabinet position with an American president if you oppose what he stands for and plan to come in and fight with him. And that's what Tillerson and McMaster and Mattis did. And my friend Sebastian Gorka can tell stories about this because he's someone who was in the government and fought very hard to implement the policies that President Trump wanted to implement. He thought this was the worst deal ever. We know he campaigned on this as a candidate. But when he came into office, he did take time to evaluate what had to be done. And I think that was done. But he had to fight with his advisors who didn't want to implement his policies. They kept talking him out of what he wanted to do. And eventually he got tired of it when there was no solution forthcoming to fix the agreement. I might add, this agreement is not fixable. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And eventually some of these advisors left. He brought in John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And voila, the president made an historic decision to withdraw from this fatally flawed agreement.
And how would you answer critics who say that Trump's maximum pressure sanctions policy was a failure after the U.S. withdrew?
Well, there were no easy answers to Iran's nuclear program. Iran was cheating on the JCPOA. We know this from the Iran Nuclear Archive, which Peter mentioned earlier. We know right now that there are covert nuclear sites where the uranium traces have been found, which basically is telltale signs of activities in violation of the JCPOA, covert nuclear weapons work. So what's the alternative? Well, President Trump pulled out. He put maximum pressure, very strong sanctions on Iran to try to deny it access, not just to economic resources, but to make it harder for it to import technology that it would need to advance its nuclear program. Was it perfect? No. But the alternative was to go to war with Iran. And President Trump is an American first guy. I am too. And he wanted to keep America out of unnecessary wars, not to start new wars. You may remember, Jim, that there was a drone that was shot down, an American drone in mid-2019. And we were about to go to war with Iran over that. And at the last minute, President Trump reversed the decision of his advisors and said, I'm not going to kill 100 to 200 Iranians for shooting down an unmanned drone. I'm not going to start an unnecessary war with Iran. So you can say maximum pressure didn't completely succeed, but then one has to argue, well, what would the alternative be? And I think some of the neocons and people who have gotten into a lot of these wars think that we should have attacked Iran. I don't think that would have worked because so much of the program is underground. I think the solution is to isolate Iran, implement very strong sanctions, and I believe that President Trump put the most effective policy possible to counter this threat.
And Peter, Fred mentioned Iran's drone threat. And what about drones and cruise missiles? We hear a lot about ballistic missiles, but Iran has been very active in the drone warfare front, going back to its 2019 attack on Saudi oil facilities and its continued use of drones to attack U.S. advisors and trainers in Iraq. And in late October, there was an Iranian drone attack on the U.S. base in Syria. So how much of a threat do these drones pose?
I think both cruise missiles and UAVs don't get enough attention, once again, along with the broader missile question when you're talking about Iran. They're definitely a threat. I wouldn't say cruise missiles and drones are a nuclear threat right now, as the missiles, I think, potentially will be and are certainly meant to be. I mean, Iran has land attack cruise missiles. They've got anti-ship cruise missiles. They have ground launch cruise missiles. And submarine launched cruise missiles. There's like 10 different models, and they keep building them. So they believe in these systems. Once again, there's prestige involved in it. There's the deterrence, the defense. Iran's views on using these sort of systems is informed by their experience in the Iran-Iraq War back in the 1980s. And of course, they don't have an air force. So this is the way they can convey these threats, the way they can project power. They can also proliferate them. We haven't talked about that, but they proliferated these capabilities as well, especially to the Houthis. And of course, they're in tight with the Syrians. So that's obviously another concern. There are some significant challenges when we talk about nuclear, since this is about the nuclear negotiations and miniaturizing a nuclear weapon to fit inside of a nose cone of a large missile, but imagine trying to do it with a cruise missile or a UAV. But it is possible. We've had nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. The Russians have had nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. So this is something that the Iranians may be thinking about. And what really keeps me up at night, Jim, is that how little we really know about what's going on in Iran. I mean, if you go back and look at the history of this, I don't think we had ideas that Iran might be involved. We were very in the 90s worried about Russian involvement with the Iranians in building the Bushehr reactor. But there was other sources outside of the intelligence community that cued us to the Iranian nuclear program. And how many times have we found new sites? And Fred mentioned these other sites where they've found traces of material. So what don't we know? That's what's really, really, really scary. And what we know already is scary enough. What we don't know is scary. So the Iranians may be working on this. And of course, as somebody looks at WMD, these are vehicles, these UAVs and these cruise missiles that can certainly be used for chemical or biological weapons as well. And they're difficult to detect. A cruise missile, for instance, and a drone have a very low radar cross section. They can fly low. They're maneuverable, means they can come from any sort of direction if there's a gap in your radar system. I wrote a paper about this on Iran's programs like probably a year or so ago. If people are interested in looking it up, it might be a little bit out of date, but I think it gives some good data on the importance of this program. They have a land attack cruise missile, the Sumar, which has a 2,000 kilometer range. That covers the Middle East. It certainly covers countries that we're concerned about. The Ghadar anti-ship cruise missile, which can cover the Gulf, has a range of 300 kilometers. So these are something we need to worry about from a conventional standpoint, and maybe at some point in the future from an unconventional standpoint. So, and these, we've been looking at developing capabilities under missile defense for dealing with ballistic missiles, and we made tremendous strides. But looking at cruise missiles and UAVs is another, defense technology challenge that we're going to have to embrace, especially when we see Iran's capabilities. And once again, the other thing I mentioned earlier is the proliferation. If they transfer these sort of capabilities to other non-state actors or even state actors, it extends Iran's influence beyond Iran's borders. Think about the war in Yemen and the Houthis, right? Think about our ships and our servicemen operating in the Middle East. This is something that we definitely need to be concerned about, and it is going to be a priority of theirs. And interestingly, Jim, they take great pride in developing these systems because they say, look, we're in it, for internal propaganda purposes and for international propaganda purposes. Look what we've been able to develop, despite this international sanctions on us. And as we know, Iran is scouring the world for technology that they can use in these systems, not just the cruise missiles and UAVs, but missiles and nuclear systems. And they've become experts of smuggling. And then I also worry about, I don't know if we'll get into this, but I'll stop here, but I hope we get a chance to maybe talk about their relationship with North Korea, which also could aid and accelerate any of these programs, not necessarily UAVs and cruise missiles, but certainly missiles in their nuclear program.
Okay, that's a very interesting point you bring up, Peter. And I'd like to ask Fred, you've also worked on North Korean proliferation matters, I think when you were at the State Department, maybe before that at CIA. But how do you assess Iran's relationship with North Korea and what that means not only for its nuclear program, but for ballistic missile program?
This is an important question, and I want to reiterate that Peter is exactly right. We do not talk enough about Iran's missile program. It is a nuclear weapons delivery system. That is the purpose of it. And Iran's missile program is entirely based on assistance from North Korea. North Korea's is based on assistance from the Russians. The North Koreans perfected and changed the designs. They then sent the designs to Iran, and they made their own changes to it. And we know there's been very close collaboration and funding from Iran to North Korea for North Korea to develop certain missile designs. There have been reports of Iranian nuclear scientists attending underground nuclear tests in North Korea. We don't have any evidence I'm aware of that North Korea has shared its nuclear weapons technology or nuclear weapons designs with Iran. But it's pretty clear that A.Q. Khan, the father of the North Korean nuclear program, provided nuclear weapons information, not just to North Korea, but to Iran and to Libya, and probably provided Iran with a blueprint for a nuclear bomb. We know he did this for North Korea. It's a Chinese blueprint that Khan got from the Pakistani government. In all likelihood, he gave the same design, if not a similar one, to Iran. So I think there's a very close collaboration. We just don't know exactly how close this collaboration is between these two nations on the nuclear weapons effort.
And Peter, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah. I mean, they have a very secretive relationship, and I certainly hope that inside the government that they have better information than we're seeing outside the government. I've tried to write on this a couple of times, and the information is very, very scarce. Although I did write a piece in the Daily Signal a few months ago talking where a U.S. government official, said that long-range missile cooperation between Iran and North Korea has resumed. I think that was the word that they used. But I didn't know a lot about what was going on before, and I don't know exactly where it stands now. But it was said publicly, so it was a tidbit that gave us an idea that they are working together. They supposedly have a scientific and technical cooperation agreement, but not much is out there. And I hope that our intelligence community and those of our friends and allies are able to gather information. But as we know, both Iran and North Korea are hard targets, very, very difficult. And I often caution friends and colleagues about being critical of the intelligence community. Both Fred and I are veterans of that, and not just in their self-defense, but understanding how difficult it is to work against hard targets. They have tremendous counterintelligence capabilities. They have strong intelligence services that protect their secrets well, and it's very difficult. But I'm hoping that inside the government they know a lot more about what's going on, because think about what a witch's brew that is. North Korea is very capable on missiles, right? North Korea has some space capabilities. These are things that Iran wants. I mean, North Korea today has done some ejection tests of missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Iran feels very strongly about its submarine force as well, and has put some cruise missiles on these boats to protect its interests and project its interests in the Persian Gulf, which obviously puts American and partners and allied naval forces in harm's way. So I really worry about that there is this sort of cooperation going on that would accelerate Iran's programs. And of course, Iran may be willing to pay for this. And of course, North Korea is always looking for hard currency, things to get, perhaps, other things, energy supply. So I would think that there is. And of course, the other thing, I think that North Korea, which is very capable in terms of their ballistic missiles, would also like to get their hands on Iranian technology regarding cruise missiles and UAVs for its interests. So there's this sort of, just a perfect, sinister relationship that's possible there that I think we really need to worry about and try to counteract if we can in terms of counterproliferation capabilities. And Fred knows a lot about this from his time in government, just in the Bush administration, I'm sure, when his work with John Bolton on the Proliferation Security Initiative. So it's just really not a good mix. Iranian and North Korean missiles, nuclear weapon desires. Obviously, North Korea has nuclear weapons. even space operations. Once again, there's this very close tie. In fact, the military technology control regime, basically puts space launch vehicles and ICBM's technology in the same category because they're similar. The idea that Iran, which has a mix of both liquid propelled and solid fuel propelled rocket motors and missile motors for its systems, it wants to move in a direction towards solid fuel, and so does North Korea. So there's a lot of bad possibilities there. I mean, the Shahab missile, right? We have 3 variants of that. Is originally a no-dom. There's worries that Iran may have gotten hold of the Musudan medium-range ballistic missile, a North Korean missile, which is based on a Russian capability. And then there's the Hwasong 15. I mean, there's a lot of things these two sides can trade. And I may be a little out of date on this, but I remember there were times that there was flights that people were watching that traveled over China directly to Iran between North Korea and Iran. I don't know where that stands today. It's probably something I should look back into, but there were things in the open press about that a long time ago. And the Chinese were turning, I think, a blind eye to that sort of proliferation going on. And who knows what were on those aircraft, just as some of the anecdotes we've heard from Fred about, attending each other's tests of some weapon systems. But yeah, it's really a terrible axis that we might need to deal with, and they certainly can help each other. And they're both enemies of the United States, and I can see them wanting to work together to make things difficult for the United States and its friends and allies.
Okay, I'd like to go to some of the questions from the audience, and the first question would be, what is the current role and position being taken by France, Germany, and Britain in these talks? And it's sometimes forgotten that this is a multilateral pact, and Iran knows that well. The day before the talks officially started, Iranian negotiators met with Russian and Chinese negotiators, essentially who are acting as Iran's lawyers. So it's looking to its allies. And I'd like to ask Fred, what's the current role and position of our allies in these talks?
Well, when Joe Biden became president, our European allies welcomed him back to the club. This was not a good thing. We don't want to be part of this European club, which wants to go easy on Iran and push climate agreements that hurt our workers and other multilateral concerns. But what's interesting recently, Jim, is that the Europeans feel they've been pushed too far by Iran. The Wall Street Journal says today that the Europeans said that if Iran starts enriching to weapons grade, that's 90%, the talks are done. And the fact that the Europeans apparently want to stop the talks early this week, I think is a sign that as eager as they are to reverse President Trump's withdrawal of the U.S. from the agreement, they're fed up with Iran's behavior. And I think that's good news for international security. I hope they will join us in imposing a new maximum pressure campaign against Iran.
Hey, Jim, I think it's also important. I agree with Fred. I think it's also important to understand that we can't expect help from the Chinese or the Russians on this issue. The Chinese are very opportunistic in their foreign policy. Any time that things go bad with the West and Iran, China will take advantage of it. The Russians have interests in Iran that are different than ours. And of course, our relationships with both of those countries in great power competition today are very, very difficult. So it's the negotiations are fraught with difficulties. And like I said, I don't expect to get a lot of support, even though non-proliferation is in the interests of China and Russia. I don't expect to get a lot of support, since it will cause the United States to potentially have to deal with challenging issues in the Middle East involving Iran, which will stretch our resources. Certainly when there's other matters, we're worried about Russia and Ukraine today. Think about that, Europe, and of course China in Asia, and our forces, which comes down to the fact that we need to recapitalize our military capabilities after many years of tremendous pressure on them. We have to reinvigorate our nuclear deterrence, continue with missile defense and other things. But I'm saying I think that they don't mind, Russia and China would not mind the United States being strategically distracted by an Iran problem, so that they can do what they want to do in their regions or sphere of influences.
Okay, I have a related question from the audience. Do your speakers credit the possibility that the Biden administration has to exhaust diplomatic options, including trying to restart the JCPOA, in order to begin building the international coalition of the Europeans, Russia, and China against Iran's nuclear program? Do you want to take that first, Peter?
I'm sorry, you warbled it, Jim. Could you read that again? I'm sorry, I apologize, but we had a little bit of a transmission thing, and I don't want to miss anything important.
Okay. Do you credit the possibility that the Biden administration must first exhaust diplomatic options, including trying to restart the JCPOA, in order to begin building the international coalition of Europeans, Russians, and Chinese against Iran's nuclear program? The same thing that was going on back in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, I think, diplomacy is the place to start. There's no question about that. We have to test Iran's diplomatic intentions, their strategic intentions, and that's what's going on, especially under this new regime. Although, as we know, the Ayatollah makes the calls here, but we do have a new president who's not necessarily, Iranian presidents are not usually that critical, I think, in decision making in national security matters. I think it's made by a small group of people surrounding the Ayatollah. But I think, you do have to test their diplomatic intentions. That will be critical, and I think that's the place to start. And if negotiations fail, then they may fail. My view is right now is that a bad deal is worse than no deal. If we go back to the situation with the JCPOA and its significant flaws that Fred and I and you have talked about throughout this program, they're all well known. I don't think we've accomplished anything. The sunset provisions. I mean, Iran has to swear off nuclear weapons in perpetuity, not just for a few years. They have to swear off fissile material production, forever. There's places they can get fissile material if they actually are pursuing nuclear power. So there are ways of doing this, but I think we do need to start with diplomacy, and that gives us an opportunity to show our good intentions, share the concerns of many, many others. I mean, we're representing a lot of countries. Nobody wants to see this proliferation issue explode, using an important term there, right? Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state is not good for regional stability or international stability. It's not just the United States, and that is interested in this, or Israel. This affects, Saudi Arabia. It affects the Arab states in the Middle East. There's proliferation concerns. Once again, imagine if Iran were to transfer something to Syria or some other, even a non-state actor. I mean, that's really, really frightening. This is just not in the interest of the United States. This non-proliferation effort is in the interest of the global community. And so that's something I think people need to understand. But if you start with diplomacy and you show that it has failed, I think that gives you certainly license and right to take undertake more difficult sanctions or measures against the Iranian regime.
Jim, can I respond real briefly, 30 seconds? I agree with all that, but we have to negotiate from strength, and Biden hasn't done that. He's been desperate to rejoin this nuclear deal. He hasn't cared how Iran behaves. If we negotiate from weakness, the nuclear deal is going to get worse, and Iran is going to get nuclear weapons anyway. And that's why elections have consequences. When you elect an incapable president who is incapable of being commander-in-chief, who does not understand the threats facing this country, it is enormously threatening to our national security.
Okay. Let me just take one more from the audience before we wrap things up. Let's see. There was a juicy one I'm trying to get to. Okay, here it is. What do you predict would happen if Israel decides it can't wait anymore and mounts an attack on, say, Isfahan? Are the Iranian people at a point where that would set off a general, would set off a backlash against the regime, or would they be more likely to rally to the flag?
I think an attack like that would set off a very devastating war, and I don't believe the Israelis will use military action until they absolutely have to, maybe when they think Iran is about to conduct an underground nuclear test. Instead, I think Israel is going to continue its very effective sabotage efforts to destroy Iranian nuclear sites and to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. We've seen a bit of that this year and last year, and I think it's going to be stepped up.
Jim, those are the tough questions that policymakers have to deal with. And when I think about these things, because they are really, really hard questions, and it's important for people to understand how difficult it is to be a policymaker and have to try to predict the future. And I'm always reminded, I think it was Neil Boris who said that prediction is hard, especially about the future. So on that note, I think that's a very, very difficult question, but an important question that policymakers, whether in Israel, the United States, or elsewhere, are wrestling with today.
Okay, and I'd like to just wrap it up with the $64 million question. If you were advising, you can split it up 32 million each. If you were advising President Biden, what should be U.S. policy at the Vienna talks and on the broader nuclear issue?
Fred, do you want to go first?
Mr. President, walk out of the talks, resume President Trump's maximum pressure campaign. The talks are a fraud. Stop trying to revive this terrible deal. Iran is not ready to talk or negotiate in good faith. Let's work with our allies, strong sanctions, diplomatic isolation.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think a bad deal, as I said before, is worse than no deal. And we don't want to buy into a program. I don't even like the longer and stronger idea. I thought that was a cute bumper sticker, but I think we really need to think about is like it's stronger and forever, not or stronger and never. Because we cannot allow Iran to develop its nuclear capabilities because they cannot be trusted. The other thing I worry about, Jim, is that you're talking about sanctions. Anytime you put money in Iran's pocket, it's going to go to bad purposes. The money from the JCPOA, instead of going to the folks of Iran, building human infrastructure or human capital or to the benefit of the people of Iran, went to a military buildup, which we're seeing with things like the UAVs and the cruise missiles and things along that line. And we haven't said it enough, but Iran is the most active state sponsor of terrorism in the world today, right? And they sponsor other regimes that are state sponsors, such as Syria. And look what they're doing. Look at what they're doing in Yemen. I mean, this is a malevolent regime, and we have to be very careful about that. But we need to address those issues that Fred and I and you have talked about. The sunset provisions, the ballistic missiles, uranium enrichment, verifications, full transparency. And we should not be afraid to walk away from the talks and show that Iran that we're serious and we're going to be tough.
Okay, and with that, I'd like to bring this panel to a close. I'd like to thank our speakers for some very illuminating points, and also I'd like to thank the audience for some pretty tough questions. And I wish I could have got to them easier, but this technology is frustrating to a Luddite like me. But thank you, everyone, and good afternoon from the Heritage Foundation.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
Good to be here.